From the CUBE studios in Palo Alto and Boston, bringing you data-driven insights from the CUBE and ETR. This is Breaking Analysis with Dave Vellante.
Our research indicates that data platform wars have entered an entirely new phase, one where open data is no longer a marketing slogan, and governance catalogs are now the new control point, beyond which the next price of entry, we think, will be an emerging control point that we call Systems of Intelligence, or SOI. Hello and welcome to this week's theCUBE Research Insights powered by ETR. In this breaking analysis, and just a few days removed from Snowflake Summit 2025, George Gilbert and I reconvene to unpack how Snowflake has moved from steward of its pristine proprietary data platform to orchestrating an ecosystem in a world that enables any compute engine to operate on any open data formats. Now, last week, George and I framed the company's Rubicon moment, meaning the pivot from analytic warehouse to enabler of intelligent data apps. And this year, Snowflake doubled down on its simplicity message, bringing that ethos into AI, and in addition, and importantly, extending its governance model further into the open data ecosystem. Now, they do that by using Polaris for Iceberg Federation and Openflow for data pipelines outside of the Snowflake walled garden. Taken together, these moves signal a deliberate strategy to ease storage lock-in, something customers are demanding, while tightening its grip on the policy and metadata control plane. At the same time, Snowflake is bringing conversational and powerful AI with rich semantics to harmonize data and really try to become the trusted source to feed up to agentic applications. And the bottom line is all this evolution, it's dragging Snowflake up into a new competitive battlefield, which we've talked about quite a bit, not just with Databricks, but also application vendors like Salesforce and ServiceNow and SAP and Palantir and Celonis and others. So on balance, we see tremendous opportunities for Snowflake, but these TAM expanders, if you will, they come with risks. So George, welcome again. It's just great hanging with you this week, and let's do more.
All right, we've got a lot to work through today. There was a lot of announcements and a lot of context to add.
Well, a big theme of today is that openness is going to bring new adversaries, not only the hyperscalers pushing Iceberg native services, but also these application vendors that we just talked about, embedding their own IP to create digital twins and even data movement and connector incumbents within the Snowflake ecosystem like Fivetran. They're going to be defending their turf. The question before us is whether Snowflake's evolving architecture can convert cooperation into control and secure the high ground in a landscape filled with well-funded challengers. And of course, the chess moves that we're looking for Databricks to make in the coming week. So that's the setup, but we're going to drill into the technical underpinnings now, the competitive implications, and of course, the customer realities of Snowflake's post-walled garden strategy. We're also going to explore what it means for the next decade of data, AI, and enterprise value creation. So let's do sort of have a North Star conversation first, and then we'll get into it. Coming out of Snowflake Summit 2025, we believe the industry is moving past static dashboards, which we're showing here, toward this agent-driven systems of intelligence. So on the left, you see this mosaic of charts. It's summarizing yesterday's news. It's great, it's helpful, but fundamentally it's a look back, it's a historian's view. And you know, they kind of narrowly hint at what's next, but it's left to the user to figure that out. Now, on the right side, it's different, right? You've got this dynamic model. It links all the stages of revenue from net new prospects all the way down to granular lead sources. And this architecture doesn't just report the KPIs and the changes in KPIs, rather it attempts to explain them, and it predicts what's next. And really importantly, makes recommendations for what to do next in the same workflow. So in essence, it's the progression from looking in the rear view mirror to an operational control plane that really runs operations in real time, or at least guides them. So we think this concept is at the crux of crossing the Rubicon for data platforms. That was the theme of our breaking analysis last week. And Snowflake's message this past week, at least one of them, was that analytics are becoming conversational and increasingly part of daily operational workflows where business users are really in control. And so with that framing in place, let's dig into how this digital twin mindset changes the game for pipeline management and other aspects of Snowflake's operations and stack. And for that deeper analysis, we'll hand it to the architect behind these slides. George, take it from there.
So let me try and distill in one analogy the transition we have to go through. When the web first emerged, we had mostly static web pages presenting information, and some people got as far as advanced as presenting analytic data, business intelligence data in a web page as well. But e-commerce wasn't really commerce; it was a brochure. And the transition, the profound transition was when you went from presenting information about products to being able to buy, because that meant you were not just informing decisions, you were going to operationalize it. And you needed not just analytics, but operational applications. That's the equivalent transition we're going through. And that the difference between a dashboard and a system of intelligence, as we're defining it, building on Geoffrey Moore's original categorization of all the different types of systems, a dashboard presents information like that presentation-oriented web page, but a system of intelligence integrates all the drivers of your business. The metrics are a reflection of all your operations and how they work together. And so the metrics are not just a business intelligence artifact, they become control points, like in a power plant. And we're going to get into that and how profound a transition that is for data platforms and the technology required to do it, and then look at how Snowflake has, how far it's gone along in this direction.
Okay, so thank you, George. So let's get into a little bit more of this theme. Last week was crossing the Rubicon, and it's filled with peril. Rubicon, of course, was the shallow river that Caesar crossed, and it looks unassuming, but there's all kinds of peril associated with it. So in the first slide, we established this North Star vision. This one here exposes the next challenge. Our premise is that even if the industry can ingest data from, say, a digital twin, we're only partway across the river, because write back and updates, they're clunky or they're not even enabled. So picture the metric tree here as an operational control plane that can detect changes and send signals to the system of intelligence. That's that green real estate that we talked about last week at length. But unless we can push new data and then consequent actions back into the operational system that can then enable taking action. Like, for instance, think about optimizing your marketing spend in a CRM, or maybe scheduling a delivery in a supply chain app, or changing the plan. We're still missing, that real opportunity, without that ability to write back and actually take action. So Snowflake signaled its intent here with Unistore several years ago. Now it's acquired Crunchy, which in our view is probably an indication of a Unistore miss. And it creates a bit of confusion in the marketplace. Maybe George will comment on that, maybe not. Snowflake's embrace of Iceberg, of course, creates opportunities, but also technical challenges. For example, it's got to link control plane metrics to operational action. That's going to require event streams, things like policy engines, knowledge graphs, and that transcend just sort of transactional tables that we become used to within the Snowflake environment. So, George, this raises a pivotal question. What architectural moves must data platforms make, Snowflake specifically, to support this true bidirectional loop? So, and maybe you could explain why dashboards alone won't cut it.
Okay, so the core principle, it sounds kind of wonky, is how do you model your data? What are you representing? And the dashboards underneath are fundamentally like OLAP cubes, metrics and dimensions. They're a restricted view that summarizes what's going on in operations. But Alex, if you bring up the slide again, that's what's supporting the user interface. And you can represent, if you have enough views, you can represent the metric tree. But the critical point is, if you want to move that from being an analytic artifact to being something that drives operations, then you need to be able to change metrics to change operations. And operations is not a cube. Operations is a much richer representation. Each company's is different, and a digital twin underneath the technical implementation, even the graphical ones, is like a knowledge graph, and that's why you can't really model it in a SQL database. There has to be a layer above. So right now we have this tremendous infrastructure in the industry to do these ETL or ELT pipelines to transform the data as it's structured in all these operational systems, which today are islands. We bring them into these views. These are the gold artifacts when you get through the ELT process, and we present them in the dashboards. The dashboards themselves are islands today, but if you have a comprehensive way to link all the metrics, you build a metric tree so that the dashboards themselves are linked. But then if you want to be able to take action and operationalize a decision, the dashboards start to answer, they answer what happened. If they're all linked, you can see why. You might even get recommendations as to what should we do next. But if you want to take action, you need to be able, it's not just write a transaction to a local database. You need to be able to update the operational application. If it's just a local database, then you're just writing a new data app, and then still you have to ETL or reverse ETL the data back into the operational application. It's a fundamental mindset shift and an architectural shift for these companies, the data platform companies. How far do you want to move from producing analytic artifacts to being an application platform?
Got it. Okay, so something you hear from us often is that this evolving enterprise architecture is bringing together and integrating analytics with operations. So this recurring theme in our research is that if you just bolt on transactions and metadata and governance onto data in a sequential analytic pipeline, and then you shove that all into a data lakehouse, that's not enough. You need to have tight architectural linkages between insight, action, and governance. And so this diagram that George created allows us to visualize that integration. And so take note here, the system of agency sits above the digital twin. So think of it as an autonomous entity that, like a human, might ask the system of intelligence, why is the sales funnel stalling? Or why are shipment delays piling up? And then it can push recommendation or remediation steps straight through to the CRM or ERP. All the while, governance metadata keeps those agents from going rogue and going off the rails. So that's the big vision anyway. But we believe this three-tier architecture of engagement, intelligence, and agency built on top of this harmonized data infrastructure, something we talk about a lot, that marks the gnarly part of the Rubicon crossing. The question now is which vendors are going to populate each layer, how fragmented will the picture get? And George, Snowflake, they kind of fired an opening salvo with Cortex, and they misfired with Unistore, in our view. But that's new real estate here for a number of vendors like Snowflake, that SOI layer, like Snowflake, Databricks, ServiceNow, the hyperscalers, Salesforce, and others that we'll talk about. So George, break down how the operational control plane and that semantics in that green bar become essentially the lingua franca for agents, and why governance isn't just a checkbox and a bolt-on, but the critical aspect of this entire architecture.
Okay, so to start with a use case, let's say you are working on some demand shaping activities that would be typically associated with CRM, but you want to understand their impact on your ability to fulfill that demand. That might typically be associated with ERP and supply chain apps. And we know that there's hundreds and thousands of islands of operational apps, including the bespoke ones. And the only way you can understand the impact of actions before you take them in order to understand the best course of action is when you move from islands of operational applications to an integrated view. Now, this has been, a dream for decades, but we're beginning to see vendors move into this space, this green area, this system of intelligence where you harmonize the operational applications. But basically, the point here is that you harvest and harmonize the business logic from the operational applications. We've talked about data as a corporate asset for decades, but now we have to treat the business logic as a corporate asset, because that's the only way. If we harmonize it, we're going to be able to see the impact of our actions in one area all the way across the enterprise. That's how you optimize a decision. It's the scope and fidelity of this control plane. So the key point to understand is that becomes the most valuable piece of real estate, because everyone's focused on agents right now, but agents are programmed by data. That means think of an agent like a robot, and it has to perceive its environment. If it's just navigating over 2D snapshots of data in a relational database, it's hard to capture a lot of rich context. If it's looking at the system of intelligence, this digital twin is like a 4D dynamic map. The agent can perceive the entire state of the business and decide what's the best course of action. But critically, when it wants to operationalize a decision, even if it informs a human and then the agent goes and operationalizes the decision, it does it through, or it eventually will go through the system of intelligence, because that's where the business logic lies, and it figures out what to update. This is key to why we talked about that trolling between Benioff and Nadella. Nadella was saying the systems of agency will talk directly to the CRUD databases below the systems of record. He's trying to say SAS will go away because he's not that competitive there. But we're saying there's going to be many layers in between to mediate all that. And that's why we see vendors who are building that system of intelligence having a critical advantage. And just the last point to make, we always have in every era an infrastructure layer, a platform layer, application layer. In the era of procedural code, the infrastructure was compute. The platform was like an application server that contained all these islands of procedural code. And then the applications were presentations and the logic. What's going on now is that the data is the infrastructure. The platform is the model of the data. And the model is how you program the applications, which are in the agents. And so it's a very different world. And the key point to make is that as we see these new layers, we have these traditional platform dynamics where when you have a new layer, it's called like platform envelopment. There's the potential for platform envelopment. The layer below can lose control of feature differentiation and pricing power if they don't move up or have the upper layers tied tightly to optimize their layer. So that's the world we're moving into.
And we've seen these shifts before in previous eras. We've seen it, you go back to Oracle and some of the moves they had to make because of similar risks, but we'll save that for another day. Let's try to bring into focus what we learned at Snowflake Summit, which paraded a fire hose of new features and announcements. It was a little bit like a mini reInvent. And from that and the conversations that we've had with product executives and customers, and some of the reconnaissance that George did, George sketched out a Snowflake reference architecture that we're going to talk about here, and it maps to the model that we've been articulating for a while. So that's shown here on the upper left. Our premise is that the yellow block up top, that's the Cortex agents. That's the way Snowflake plans to participate in the AI conversation, literally. I'm going to ask George to address if this is Snowflake's attempt at the SOI layer. But before I do that, look at below that, you got semantics views, big emphasis of the conference, plus the new embedding and search services that are designed, I presume, to address the digital twin semantics. Think of them as, functions that let agents speak in business language, human language, not just SQL. The orange part, that's the Horizon and Polaris bridge. That's where the governance and the open table formats come in and they converge. It's the way Snowflake is, answering how do we enforce policy across native and Iceberg data without sacrificing performance and to a certain extent their moat. And of course, the foundation rests on their ability to deliver that Gen 2 capability, adaptive compute. Gen 2 gives better performance. Even though it's a little bit more expensive, we can talk about that. And adaptive compute all this is up against sort of open compute. I mean, any engine, Spark, Trino, you name it, as external iceberg tables allow any engine to operate on any open data in an open table format. And so, the challenge is the best engine wins. So Snowflake better have the best engine, right, George? So then you've got the two arrows here. You show AI SQL for natural language querying on the read side, and then Openflow to pipe in data that has been traditionally outside of Snowflake's purview, a signal that Snowflake's trying to extend its TAM beyond the walled garden. So George, you've got the inside baseball. Walk us through how these layers interact and where the competitive seams might still be exposed, which is a big theme of our conversation today.
Okay, so key points. And Alex, let you bring the slide back up again. The most important point is that we're moving from a world where the DBMS controlled the data and it controlled the source of truth. So all new workloads were an extension of what the DBMS did. And that's how you expanded your TAM. That's how you reached new personas. But in a world where we're moving to open data, the customer owns the data. The control point right now is the data that you govern and define. And then your workloads your engines and tools have to compete for every workload. So there's basically two axes of competition. There's best of breed, and then integration based on simplicity and synergy of functionality across workloads and governance. And that's where we're going to dive deep into the Snowflake reference architecture. We're going to look at how deep they've gone in each one, and then the synergy of using them together.
Okay, great. So let's look at how Snowflake supports intelligent applications. And the big question that we've been asking is really, how far can it go up the stack, and what does that mean? But so building on that reference stack, Alex, you bring up the next slide. It digs deeper into what we're calling Snowflake's systems of agency and engagement. Our thinking is the company's trying to stitch together a full AI application framework that governs data and agent-driven actions. So data comes in, it's got to start the governance there, and then agent-driven actions out. But the questions remain in terms of how far Snowflake can go and how much territory it can really capture there. So on the left, George, you're showing fine-grained, role-based access control and continuous ingest, which ensures that data coming into the system are clean and quality and compliant. And then that flows the processing engine that can now handle structured and unstructured data. And then you show the retrieval engine, where Cortex Analyst turns table semantics into text to SQL, and then Cortex Search brings in things like vector and keyword to hit both structured and unstructured data in the corpus. That was a big emphasis that Snowflake made. And that yellow block is presumably where all the magic happens, and we still have some questions. The Cortex agents presumably answer questions, but in our model, they also have to orchestrate this multi-step playbook, and they got to behave according to corporate edicts, and even they got to tap external tools. So George, is this why Snowflake is leaning so hard on AI observability and policy metadata to enable this write back capability that you're always talking about? And the strategic point here, I think, is that isn't it semantic context? So George, you've dissected the Cortex pipelines in detail. Walk us through where Snowflake shines today, where the architecture you think still needs to mature, and how this framework positions Snowflake against both Databricks or hyperscalers and other app vendors in this race toward operational AI.
Okay, so we should start with the tentpole workload that Sridhar, the CEO who took over 15 months ago or something like that. His tentpole workload is talk to your data to widen the accessibility of analytics and interacting with the data. Alex, if you can bring the slide back up. The key point then is you need to structure the data. Underneath the covers, agents will be able to navigate the data based on how you've modeled it in the semantic views. These are the definitions of the metrics and dimensions that are both human and agent readable. It uplevels the data from strings that a DBMS stores to things that humans and agents know how to talk about. This was, Dave, back to your point earlier where you turn things into human language, and you structure it into cubes. So the key is, again, how well you've structured the data and the scope of it. The semantic views are now in the DBMS. They used to be in the BI tool, and we're going to come back to that because the BI tools were good at presentation, and they had structured their data into these semantic views or semantic layers to make it easier to present the data, but then it was an island just for that tool. The second part of talking to your data is integrating the unstructured information, and that's the green box on the right, where this is based on technology, I believe that was the Neva acquisition that brought Sridhar into the company, where you're creating vector embeddings of the chunks of the documents. You're able to do search. Their secret sauce here is not just vector search, but lexical search, which is more precise. The semantic and embedding search gives you similarities. The lexical search gives you precision. You combine the two, you re-rank them, you get very good results. Now, the talk to your data gives you the ability to navigate both the structured data and, let's say, the unstructured data contracts, say, that might give context to structured data that you're asking about. Now, the key point here is their semantic views. They jump-started this by importing from BI tools, starting with Looker. I don't know which others, but then crucially, what they add is, as the end user interacts with the data, the semantic view learns more and more about the structure of the data. And so that rather than in BI tools, you had to specify everything top down, here you combine a top-down start and you learn, and the richer and richer view, or broader and broader view, emerges bottom up. That's new, that the BI vendors have not done, because they were just supporting their own tools. Then the one open issue that I would highlight is that the searching over unstructured data, there are other approaches like Glean and the Microsoft 365 graph, which expose richer structures around the unstructured data beyond just embedding. It ties the embeddings into a model of the people, places, things, and activities about how people interact with their productivity and collaboration actions. The reason this is important is you need both analytic data and context about, for instance, how legal and sales might interact with deciding whether a contract is from a customer meets the requirements of both, one for payment and the other for terms. And we're going to eventually need both. And so that's the open issue is the embed search re-rank that's in Snowflake as advanced as some of the best of breed guys? Is it good enough for a certain set of workloads? And then can you interoperate when you want to combine both the structured data in Snowflake through the semantic views, let's say with Glean? And we asked about this at Analyst Day. So agent-to-agent protocol might allow you to do retrieval of structured data in Snowflake, and the richer and broader search that you might get in Glean. So that's the one thing to call out there.
Great. So, again, come back to the theme of crossing the Rubicon. There are some issues. Maybe maybe they're gotchas, maybe they're not, but they're things that we think about as we try to extract the signal through the marketing noise. So to do this, we're going to zoom out to the top of the stack and really focus on the UX, the user experience layer, for a minute. We're going to show you a little screenshot from Hex, which is a BI player, where a simple natural language prompt is going to automatically surface revenue dashboards, no SQL required. So our thinking is that more than a fancy UI is needed, but this is what Hex does. It's an early example that the ISV community, and which is, by the way, part of the Snowflake ecosystem, Hex, Sigma, and others, they're in that race for the systems of engagement layer, because they can wrap a Gen AI UX around these trusted semantic models. So take a look here. Look at the red sort of swim lane highlights. They underscore Snowflake's implicit boundary. In other words, as we see it anyway, Snowflake is going to supply the semantic views and be that data infrastructure that George talked about in Cortex agents. But the front end is going to could be handled by the BI vendors. And so the strategic bet here is that if Snowflake can make its data model the industry's control point, increasingly conversational front ends, i.e. the BI vendors and the search vendors, are going to anchor on Snowflake semantics because it's more accurate and it's governed and it's trusted. So that's the upside, is you get these network effects. The risk is, losing mind share if those ISVs bolt to alternatives with other knowledge graphs. And so with that framing, George, why don't you unpack what it takes for semantic views to become the fundamental lingua franca of these external UX agents, and where Snowflake has to strengthen partnerships or even guardrails to make sure that its data model that you talked about earlier remains that single source of truth.
Okay, so this is a key point where we talked about competing for workloads and how deep you go, and then the benefit to simplicity and the benefit of synergy of integrating across workloads. This is one workload, the system of engagement, what Snowflake is calling Snowflake intelligence, where you talk to your data directly. We think this is actually going to bump up against others who are more who are better positioned by virtue of the technology assets they have and the skill sets. In this case, we're using Hex as an example, where you do not need to be directly within the Snowflake DBMS and the Horizon experience to have a best of breed talk to your data experience. The reason we used Hex, Alex, if you can bring the slide back up, in the red, the top red bar, there's an English language question that says, give me my revenue by movie genre. And then this tool, the key point to make is a system of engagement is a generative user interface where there are agents that look through a library of UI widgets and compose them. In this case, they're showing some that are already pre-made. And then at the bottom red bar, it's saying, start exploring, and it's actually generating a visualization, which will take us to the next slide. But the key point here is you're not just getting back, as in Snowflake Intelligence, a simple table and a simple visualization. You're getting a rich visualization that is interactive, that allows you to drill down. So that what we're contending is that the division of labor is Snowflake does a really good job of defining the structure of the data, in this case, in the semantic views, and Hex already supports that. And then Hex is the user experience that actually Gen AI generates to respond to the user's natural language input.
Great. Thank you, George. Okay. So we've talked, kind of aspiration and TAM potential, but let's talk about execution risks and continue with, some potential gaps here. We're going to show you another Hex enhanced diagram where revenue analysis comes from just a simple one-liner prompt. So you don't have to do joins, you don't have to group by, none of that. It's just the natural language. Give me X. So our premise is this is the kind of AI generated engagement layer that customers ultimately want and are going to expect the more they use things like ChatGPT. You remember, hey, why can't my IT be like Facebook? Well, you're going to have the same thing here across enterprise apps. So bring up the slide here. Notice the narrative call out in the red box that the system not only drew the chart, but it also wrote the first pass insight. So that's kind of cool, and it's great for speed, but it also underscores why Snowflake can't allow fuzzy semantics. I mean, it's got to be precise. It's got to be accurate. And that's the importance of the harmonization layer that we talk about. Because if that view is wrong, the output is crap. And that brings us to the swim lane discipline that George has been hammering. ISVs like Hex, they're going to duke it out. Sigma's another one. There are others. Duke it out for user mind share. Tableau, of course, with Salesforce. But so Snowflake's got to double down on being the authoritative data model that they tap into. So as Snowflake drifts up the stack, and tries to capture more of that value, it can't alienate partners. If it stays too far down, you might cede control to a Glean or a Microsoft, graph, as George was saying earlier. So George, the big question is, can Snowflake lock in its semantic views as the single source of context while enabling the ecosystem of ISVs to innovate at the UX layer? And we haven't even talked about the 4D graph in detail, but take us through where those fault lines are and what has to happen next for Snowflake Intelligence to move from sort of interesting, cool demo to really an enterprise standard.
Well, you raised that key question, which is, to what extent is it a proof of concept and a statement to show people what's possible, where really the real depth lies in the ISV community. Now, Snowflake would say, if you're talking directly to a business user, we're not really competing with Hex because that's for much more technical users. But you will see from BI ISVs, BI tools, this sort of interaction technique oriented towards non-technical business users, which is what Snowflake was targeting with the Snowflake Intelligence, from what I understand. Now, the reason we pointed this out, like this second slide, Snowflake generated a rich visualization with all the interaction widgets, and you don't have to actually control the user interface widgets directly. You can ask follow-on questions in English directly, and that controls that rich user interface. That's an example where the depth and specialization of a best-of-breed vendor will probably trump the integration and attempted simplicity of Snowflake tying their system of engagement, Snowflake Intelligent, with Cortex agents in the back end.
Great.
The question, one last issue is, now Hex ties directly to Snowflake semantic views. When it's manipulating data on behalf of the user, is it going through the Cortex agents, or is it using its own agents to go directly to the semantic views? That we don't know. I suspect they're using their own agents, and that as Snowflake's agents improve in maturity, it might enable a broader array of systems of engagement to use their complete stack.
Interesting. So best of breed agent wars. There's competition everywhere, and opportunity. Let's bring in some ETR data and scan the BI landscape with some survey data. Let me describe this. This is a view we often show. This kind of XY view. On the y-axis is shared net score. That's a measure of spending velocity. So it's essentially an account-based metric, net percent of customers out of those 1,859 that are spending more, adding or spending more within this space. And so you see we've plotted just a few BI vendors. You can see up in the top here, display sector, we've highlighted the BI. ETR's taxonomy groups analytics, BI, and big data. So it's pretty broad. So we've just picked out a few companies. Microsoft, in full transparency, we're pulling on the entire Microsoft. So this is not really a reflection of what Power BI is doing, but it is a representation of Microsoft's ubiquity, and Power BI is, pretty well adopted because it's easily available. But on the horizontal axis is that overlap within those 1,859 accounts. So think of it as account penetration. So that's why Microsoft is so deeply penetrated. The impressive part about Microsoft is virtually across its entire portfolio, it's very high on the y-axis. Anything over 40% is considered outstanding. We've plotted Hex and Sigma. We have no data on that, so just a caveat. That's just our assumption is that they're probably pretty high up on that, but we don't know for sure. You can see Looker, which is Google acquired a while ago, is also pretty high. But not nearly as penetrated as, for example, Tableau, which has respectable position on the vertical axis, not great, a little bit of red here, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner. That, by the way, is how the dots are plotted. Shared N is an indication of penetration on the x-axis, and the net score is on the left-hand side. And you can see, Tableau does okay, 14.3% net score, not great, not terrible. ThoughtSpot should be higher. It's surprising to me that it's that low. I don't know why. I have to look into that, because ThoughtSpot, earlier on when I've looked at them, is much, much higher. Qlik, we put them in there just because to have another BI vendor in there, but Qlik's really not a BI vendor. They've transitioned. They don't compete head to head. I mean, they do, but that's not their primary motivation anymore. They acquired talent, and they're building out, other value. So, but we put them in there just for context. George, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, or we should move on.
Just a quick thought, which is to remind and revisit the theme that today the business intelligence tools are presentation, they're read-only. I want to point out one thing I saw with Sigma, where they're starting to add the ability to, say, collaboratively collect data, perhaps for a forecast. That's the first hint where you're starting to say, I need to be able to write back. I need to be able to take this analytic that informs me, and I need to start updating the data on the back end. So the first step in that, the way it's done today, is you reverse ETL back through a connector to the operational application. The next step, Databricks and Snowflake both are introducing Postgres databases on their clusters, so you can add a transaction. But as we'll talk about later, that's a long way from being able to directly update the operational applications.
Great, thank you. So I believe in 2022 is when Benoit Dageville asked the audience, has anybody here heard of Iceberg? And I had heard of it. It was like myself and like 5 other hands went up, but generally speaking, it was not mainstream. And now today, everybody in the audience will have heard of Iceberg. So, Snowflake has really embraced open table formats, and that is kind of fundamental to moving beyond the walled garden. So, and it was a big conversation at Summit that Snowflake was opening up beyond that walled garden. So, Alex, you bring up the next slide. It's the company's answer, and which our research indicates is the most consequential move since the original announcement it made, of Iceberg support back in 2022. So in that blue box, you have the Horizon catalog. That is Snowflake's, proprietary governance catalog. And then you got the control plane. That's the control plane for compliance and security and discovery across every data and AI artifact. So on the right, Snowflake is federating that catalog with Apache Polaris, which is an open source REST spec for Iceberg that I think Dremio, Gravitino, and I think AWS Glue already back. So that bidirectional synchronization means policy set in Horizon flows to the data out to the external Iceberg tables, and just as importantly, permissions set by another engine can flow back in, another governance, platform. So we think this is Snowflake's bid to keep its governance moat while embracing any compute, any open data. So by owning the policy handshake, Horizon on one side, Polaris on the other, Snowflake can let, whether it's Spark or Trino or Flink, crunch the data without ceding the control point that, of course, Databricks is chasing this as well. We're going to find out this week how they're approaching it. It also lays out the foundation for AI SQL to query and Openflow to tap assets that live outside of Snowflake storage. So George, you've been tracking the open table progression since inception. You were at the Iceberg Summit this year. Walk us through how robust is this Horizon Polaris bridge? What does it mean for customers betting on Iceberg, and where Snowflake still has to prove that it can play nice with an ecosystem that includes some of its biggest competitors?
Okay, so let me reframe the context just a bit to emphasize what we started out saying in the beginning, which is that the control point has shifted from what data your DBMS manages and owns to what data do you define and govern. And by define, I mean how you model it. And the govern is, are you responsible for privacy, permissions, even read-write control through the metadata catalog. And the reason I want to point that out as context is 2 years ago, when Databricks announced Unity, they had always separated their compute from their data. And so the new control point was Unity Catalog and how much data they governed. And there was the sense that, oh, Snowflake is a little bit behind the eight ball because they have to own all their data in their DBMS. What is new this year is, as you pointed out, Dave, the synchronization between policy in Horizon and policy in Polaris, which manages the external Iceberg tables. And I just want to emphasize one point. It's not two-way. It flows from Horizon out to Polaris. And it's a subset. It's a subset of what's in Horizon, but over time, more and more of what's in Horizon will flow to Polaris. And over time, Horizon will get richer. So your governance will always be richest in Horizon. But the point is now there's consistency across what's in the Snowflake controlled governance and what's in the external Iceberg ecosystem. So the open issues that we need to see are, will Databricks support the Polaris API for governing Iceberg? Because they're trying to say, having bought the stewards of Iceberg, Tabular, they're trying to say you don't have to care about the difference in the data. So the question is, will Unity support the Polaris API? And to what extent are they ready to support Iceberg, both read mode and write mode with their tools? Because when they announced Uniform, they could read Iceberg, but they couldn't write to it. And they have the Iceberg development team. So let's see how far that's converged next week.
Great. Yep, we will be watching for sure. Okay. One of the big themes that we talked about, I think it started, frankly, in 2022, certainly was bigger in 2023, was just the whole data engineering workloads. George, your research uncovered at the time, this is a couple of years ago, you were really the first to hop on this, at least in our community, that customers were moving data engineering workloads that really didn't need the high performance, higher cost of Snowflake's engine. They were moving them outside of Snowflake and bringing them to some kind of Spark execution engine or alternative, typically Databricks. And Ali Goetze really doubled down on this, and really after we exited 2021, which was didn't matter what anybody spent money on, 2022 was tighten up. TCO became much more important, and so we've thus far focused on insight and governance, but every digital twin is only as good as the freshness and quality of its inputs, and cost is really a big consideration. So this is where Openflow, you've got the Gen 2 warehouse, and you've got adaptive compute really coming into play, but there are still some open questions for us that require more research. So our takeaway from Summit is that this control plane, which is Openflow NiFi powered, if you will, is being positioned as more than just an ingestion tool, but as I say, questions are still there. So by tying lineage and policy directly to the Horizon Polaris framework, Openflow presumably can ensure the same governance envelope, George, and follow data from origination to agentic taking action. You bring in the Gen 2's performance. It's 2.1x the performance. It varies, but it's got a bump. I think they're charging like a 30% more. So if you can get better than 30%, you're going to have better TCO. And then adaptive compute eliminates that need for t-shirt sizing complexity, something Oracle always attacked Snowflake on and has had that capability for years. Then you got dynamic tables, which bring incremental views, and what we think is Snowpipes streaming through for throughput-based pricing, which we still have to confirm if the pricing has changed. I've reached out to Snowflake, but haven't heard back yet, George. But all this tells us that Snowflake is gunning for workloads that today have, at least most recently, have defaulted to Spark. Fivetran is another one that we're going to talk about. I know George Fraser has some thoughts on this. The key in our view is that if Snowflake can pull data engineering pipelines, and it announced a data science agent, so it can target that persona, especially those that have been feeding, that are feeding external Iceberg, If it can do so under its governance umbrella and keep in-house the ones that have been migrating out, it means, Horizon gets cemented as a single source of truth. If they miss that land grab and customers, they might still route metadata through someone else's catalog, and like Unity, for example, and that's going to dilute Snowflake's value add. So George, you've been tracking the pipeline wars for a long time. How will OpenFlow, how does it stack up against the incumbent tooling? How important is Gen 2 and adaptive compute? And what does Snowflake have to prove to convince these data engineering teams to keep their data in Snowflake or shift their orchestration into this new control plane?
So let me give a one customer example that reinforces a point you made. The key point, which is they need the data engineering workloads to be able to collect more and more metadata. Specifically, it's the lineage. Where did the data come from in detail? Because then all the other governance metadata upstream builds on that metadata. So your governance, the quality of what you can manage in terms of metadata depends on capturing that upstream workload. So let me give you an example that caused a lot of controversy a couple of years ago. Instacart was one of Snowflake's biggest customers. I think they were spending $60 million a year, and they moved their data engineering workloads. There was controversy publicly about this, about did they just have a better contract with Snowflake, but their spend was cut in half or more, might have been by 60%. And there was a lot of hubbub because they're key customers, so they didn't want to say much about why the spend came down. But if you were at the Databricks Summit that year, you saw that the data engineering workloads had moved to Databricks because there was the perception that they were much better on price performance because they're not as performance sensitive. So they might be able to use different compute engines specialized for throughput and not latency. And let's say the Snowflake engine, which was designed to be great at analytics, they kept the analytic workloads in there. So just Dave, recapping all the points you made, they were about improving price performance for the data engineering workloads. And without going through them all again, the key point that we don't know yet is how do they compare against open competitors, whether it's Databricks or others. Now that we have open compute, what can Snowflake do to tie it all together with simplicity? OpenFlow is a first step in that direction, but it's not. It's a journey. It's not a destination, as we're going to cover in a sec.
We've talked a little bit about Fivetran. I want to touch on that a little bit, but but in the broader question is how mature is Snowflake's tooling, and how does it compare to alternatives that are existing in the ecosystem today, like Fivetran, some of the BI vendors, as well as Databricks. We don't really know exactly what they're going to announce next week. Rob Strechay does because he just got the NDA, but he hasn't shared it with us other than to say it's pretty cool. So we're really excited to see what's coming there. But let's get deeper into the plumbing. A digital twin, as we said, has to have rich and complete event streams, and that means a ton of connectors. So OpenFlow comes out of Snowflake's Datavolo acquisition. Does it have the maturity and architectural chops to fulfill this ambition that Snowflake has? So on this chart on the left, you see Snowflake's their own docs, and they even spell out the limitations of their connectors. Like they talk about single-threaded Jira pulls. They only have basic auth, the no delete tracking, and then look at the schema next to it in the middle. That's Fivetran's map, and it's battle tested, and it's from same source ostensibly. So that visual tells you which player has more battle scars and is more tested. So the strategic question is, it's not just can Snowflake catch up, it's can it do so quickly enough to keep Horizon's governance graph authoritative. And if critical SaaS apps still flow through Fivetran or other tools, then policy lineage risks migrating outside of Snowflake's control. And George, we heard Snowflake's positioning at the analysts meeting, which was basically that Fivetran's really good at simple SaaS workloads. Snowflake's really good at the more complicated stuff. This is referring to Openflow. But walk us through what it's going to take for Openflow to close this maturity gap. How big of a head start, do firms like Fivetran have? And I know I'm kind of blending, Fivetran with Databricks, although Databricks has announced some similar sort of competitive features, and whether or not Snowflake's governance vision can hold if the ingest layer is stovepiped and fragmented.
So the key point to make is when you have connectors, it's an evergreen project. You're never done. The surface area of the operational applications and other data sources is immense. And so it's a matter of skill in understanding the internals, time to expose those internals, the simplicity and with which you can pull the data out, the resilience of those connectors to failure. And the reason it's worth pointing out is Fivetran and others, have a long head start. But we should break this into two parts. That's the connector part. The NiFi connectors are somewhat immature. Then there's the data engineering workload itself, which is authoring the transformations. And that's the second part of the Openflow offering. And that's still to be seen, like how mature that is. Just by way of comparison, the $8 billion that's Salesforce is spending on Informatica is because they have decades worth of connectors and so much metadata that they can start authoring pipelines almost on demand. In other words, you don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of SQL. You can have a much richer low-code way of authoring this stuff. And that's going to be a huge augmentation of Data Cloud at Salesforce in terms of harnessing legacy applications and data. That's worth mentioning. This is that the Openflow acquisition, it's the start of a journey. It doesn't place them on an even competitive footing right away.
Right, the Datavolo acquisition. All right, let's come back to the enterprise architecture and the opportunities and talk about maybe some of the pitfalls, the challenges, and the realities of crossing the Rubicon River. It's a little reminiscent, George, of Buttercup and Leslie navigating the fire swamp in The Princess Bride. I'm like, you're rubbing off on me. But I don't have a graphic on it. But up to now, we've focused on Snowflake's internal roadmap. But when Alex, if you bring up the next graphic, it widens the focus and brings in some of those rodents of unusual size, George, RUSs. Our premise is the SOI layer is high value real estate. We've talked about that a lot. And once you declare yourself a player aspiring to own that layer, that SOI layer, you step into a field that's already crowded. You've got SAP, you've got Microsoft, Oracle, ServiceNow, even niche specialists like Celonis. Relational AI is an interesting, potential linchpin. So when we talk about crossing the Rubicon, we're not talking about just new features. It's also about competing with new rivals. And that's a major theme of today's breaking analysis, because especially those in the application space. The BI crowd still owns this purple engagement layer that we're showing here. Snowflake and Databricks remain the orange analytic infrastructure leaders, the sort of data infrastructure. But the green band in the middle, that brain, if you will, of the intelligent app or the digital twin, that's going to become the hottest real estate and enterprise tech in our view. So whoever controls that layer is going to become the control point for agents, which will bring value in the form of why is it happening, what's likely to happen next, and what should we do about it? So we think that yellow systems of agency tier is also still up for grabs. Hyperscalers are going to have agentic frameworks. Are they going to swoop in? You got independents like Celonis, which are trying to do both layers. UiPath, which is really that agent control framework. That's their focus, the orchestration. So can Snowflake's Cortex stake an early claim, or are application giants like Salesforce going to push their own co-pilots down to subsume that space? And the answers are going to determine which vendors set the rules of engagement and who gets relegated to plumbing, which is not bad. It's a big market, but it will face margin pressures over time. So George, you've mapped each of these players to their strategic bets. You've dug into them in your research. Walk us through how you see this competitive heat map reshaping Snowflake's position post what you learned at Summit. And what moves should we expect from Snowflake and maybe next week from Databricks and then other incumbents now staring across that Rubicon at new adversaries and a new landscape, frankly?
Okay, so let me just embellish your anecdote of crossing the Rubicon. It may have been a shallow river, but by law, Roman armies were not allowed across that because that meant they were on Roman territory. The army was only allowed to be fighting external adversaries. And when Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his army, he was declaring war essentially on Rome. And the reason I bring that up is the Rubicon here is when you move from the metrics and dimensions that are the analytic parts of systems of intelligence to the broader digital twin, which is underpinned by a semantic knowledge graph. That knowledge graph is the key intellectual property that ServiceNow is building with Workflow Data Fabric. Celonis is building it with process mining. It's in there in some form with Salesforce Data Cloud. Palantir has been building it now for almost 20 years. We see the first implementation of it in SAP's Business Data Cloud. Now, the reason I point this out is you can take what's in the metric and dimension, the analytic artifacts, and if you map updates from those back to the knowledge graph, then you can operationalize decisions. This is how it's ultimately going to be done, where in the system of engagement, you interact with this rich view of the data, and it'll be specialized by task or whatever. But you need to be able to not just talk to a Postgres database, you need to be able to take the cube and go through some transformational rules and update the knowledge graph to operationalize decisions. And Blue Yonder and Relational AI are doing that already on top of Snowflake. That's the first implementation that I'm aware of. So we want to see how others are going to attack that, but that's that key Rubicon crossing moment. And the other point to make is systems of agency, that the agents themselves are not going to talk directly to systems of record. They will for one-off updates now, but that's where you still got islands. But when they need to traverse to understand the context of what's going on across the enterprise and make decisions based on the state of the enterprise, Dave, what you called that finite state machine that we also call the 4D map, then you need to go through the system of intelligence. That's going to be that layer. And the other thing, again, worth pointing out is the systems of agency understand and are programmed by that layer. That's their value is essentially defined by how richly all those other players in the green bar, the systems of intelligence, can define the state of the enterprise. The richer the map, the more functional the agents. That's where the value is going to be. AI is programmed by data.
Got it. Okay, let's close with some ETR data, just for context around momentum and market penetration. That same XY for some of the players that we just mentioned. So again, y-axis is spending velocity, otherwise known as net score. X-axis is penetration into the data set. You can see here again, we haven't chosen any sector. These are just the overall. Microsoft, ubiquitous. AWS very clearly in the mix and doing some really interesting things with SageMaker and Q further up the stack. Salesforce, we are high on Salesforce. I cannot tell you how many people that I talk to are somewhat skeptical about Salesforce because they, rightly point out that they haven't done a great job of integrating all the piece parts. I also had a conversation this week with an analyst who said they need to own they need to buy a database company, which I think is absolutely not the case. I don't think Salesforce is interested in owning that data infrastructure. I think they're more interested is in partnering with those data infrastructure players like Snowflake, like Databricks, and owning that high value real estate. We think Benioff has that vision. And I don't know as much about ServiceNow, but certainly within their domain. I mean, I know a lot about ServiceNow historically, but in the last couple of years, haven't dug into their latest strategy and architecture. But knowing what I know about them and their customers, they are in a very strong position within their domain to build that value. Yeah, Google, I think Google's got a really interesting story here coming out of Google Cloud Next. I learned a lot in Google I/O, a lot of really cool announcements. And I think we're going to be digging further into those. I am kind of an Oracle fanboy, believe it or not, because I think they've got a highly differentiated strategy, despite them being low on this vertical axis. Doesn't matter because this is not an indication of spending, it's account penetration. In Oracle, if this were spending, would be much higher on that axis. And I'm also high on IBM. I mean, they face similar issues that Oracle does in the context of ETR data. But I think what IBM is doing with the Watson data and integration, their integration strategy, I think is very strong. I think IBM is very much going to be in the mix here, as of course is SAP. They've got their estate under control. And we talked a lot extensively about Snowflake and Databricks. And then we've got Palantir and Celonis, who are also, George, really going after this. And this is just a small subset of the participants in this marketplace. We're going to see many more in varying degrees of commitment and value add. George, I'll give you the last word.
I guess I would only say that there's a new sort of taxonomy that's emerging where the data is the infrastructure. And building on your point about the comment someone made about Salesforce needing to buy a DBMS, their whole focus is the layer above. That's why they don't see themselves really deeply competing with Databricks and Snowflake. They see them as partners and providers of data, which they bring in the customer data that's modeled deeply in Salesforce. They bring it in zero copy. They might cache it. They might federate a query out to it. But Salesforce Data Cloud is competing at the platform layer where it models the customer journey and engagement. And then they view Salesforce, Databricks, legacy apps. That's why they're buying Informatica. That's the infrastructure layer. The platform layer is how you model some part of the business. So that's all the systems of intelligence entrants that we talked about. And then the agents are going to be the application layer.
Great. Well, George, I think we might have set another record here on breaking analysis. We really appreciate this. We keep going deeper, connecting dots, and thank you. And more to come next week. theCUBE is going to be at Databricks Summit. Rob Strechay will be there. George, you're going to be there as well, right?
Yep.
And I will be in San Diego at Cisco Live with Bob LaLiberte. But John and George and Rob and the CUBE team will be there. So definitely stop by and check us out. I want to thank Alex Meyerson, who's on production and manages our podcast, and Ken Schiffman as well, and Kristen Martin and Cheryl Knight help us get the word out on social media and in our newsletters, and Rob Hof is our EIC over at SiliconANGLE.com. Thank you, everybody. And remember, all these breaking analysis episodes, they're available as podcasts. Some of you I know like to just listen and not watch along, and that's very cool. And or read, but they're available wherever you listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast. I publish each week on thecuberesearch.com and siliconangle.com. You can email me at david.vellante@siliconangle.com or DM me at dvellante on X or comment on my LinkedIn posts. And check out etr.ai. They are just constantly updating their data. I'm hoping, George, they do another open table formats survey post Databricks and Snowflake like they did last year. We'll see. We'll definitely encourage them to do that, but definitely check out etr.ai, best survey data in the enterprise tech business. This is Dave Vellante for George Gilbert and theCUBE Research Insights powered by ETR. Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you next time on Breaking Analysis.